back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to our Flip Classroom and our continuing discussion of the Reformation, right? Especially the Reformation under Martin Luther, right? We are about to really get into the thick of it, into the weeds, if you will. We're talking about the Reformation that will be catalyzed by Martin Luther, right? Remember, though, a Reformation that was kind of already on its way and somebody else would have started it. And you'll actually see that, of course, as this conversation begins to grow, right? Because there were a lot of people out there that had a lot of very similar ideas to Martin Luther and the things that he had already been saying. So we need to keep that in the back of our mind when we're actually continuing this discussion, talking about the Reformation as it explodes in Europe, right? But the big thing about it that we left off in class talking about was, of course, indulgences, right? We were discussing these concepts known as indulgences, which are things that do technically exist in the Bible, right? They do exist in the Bible, and they're supposed to be things like good deeds, though, right? Like we made the example in class the other day, talking about how if Molly dropped all of her stuff and like Shelby helped her or whatever, that's what an indulgence is supposed to be. But what ends up happening during the 12th century is a lot of rogue priests and other different parishes and bishops and stuff like that start selling them, right? Which is extremely unfair and absolutely ridiculous, right? Because it's basically creating the surface level foundation of if you got money, you're getting out of purgatory a lot sooner, right? Now, there's a very famous line that you'll probably learn, actually not only during this class, but also during your religion class, which goes like this: a penny in the coffer, when a penny in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs, right? A phrase that was made popular by this guy that we're about to be talking about, or we're going to be talking about here in a couple seconds, a man by the name of Johann Tetzel, right? And Johann Tetzel, of course, that was actually present in a pamphlet that he was using to sell indulgences throughout the Holy Roman Empire and many German-speaking states, right? And it's that phrase right there and that concept which kind of is the straw that breaks the camel's back for Martin Luther and sends him into a wild fit, and he writes 95 reasons why he's mad at the church, right? Now, going into it, though, here comes this dummy, though. This guy right here might be the one that you could point the finger at and say, you are not only the living, breathing antithesis of why the Reformation needed to happen, but also you're pretty much the reason why it did happen, right? And the guy that we're talking about is none other than the pontificate, or the Pope, known as Pope Leo X, right? Who actually is a Medici Pope, right? What I mean by that is actually his last name is Medici, right? Leo X is of the Medici family of Florence, right? A living, breathing symbol of nepotism, right? Now, the thing about it, though, that you have to understand is he is going to use his money's wealth and welfare to actually get him to this very, very high office. And when he gets there, he starts deciding to up the game and really double down on this whole indulgence thing, right? Because he's going to commission new indulgences to make it so they can remodel different parts of St. Peter's in the Vatican, right? Because if you've ever actually been to the Vatican, it is not just a little beautiful. It is amazingly beautiful, right? It is absolutely massive. It's got huge ceilings and gilded roof, like what's the word I'm looking for? Like gilded crown molding, and everything is made of gold, and the altar of St. Peter is absolutely beautiful, right? And it was paid for, some of it anyway, using the indulgences that were commissioned by this guy. I've actually taken kids to Italy before, and literally one of the biggest things that comes out of their mouths is like, wow, that was a lot of indulgences they sold to pay for this thing. So going into it, though, Leo X is going to commission new ones to continue to remodel St. Peter's, right? Now, bad priests in the Holy Roman Empire are going to take it a step further, and they're going to start pushing them very, very hard so they can not only pay off church debts, but also their own, right? And so some of them famously, or one of them famously known, is Johann Tetzel, right? And Johann Tetzel is the guy that apparently is sitting right here, riding a mule right there, right? And is going to be like the nemesis of like Martin Luther. Now, Johann Tetzel, this German priest, which I always remember because it sounds a lot like pretzel, sold these indulgences, but literally tried to sell them as a higher end thing, right? He actually tries to sell them as not only indulgences for the person, but he even tries to sell more expensive ones and premium ones that not only got you into heaven faster, but also got family members that were sitting in purgatory into heaven faster, and actually reduced their time in purgatory. So if you had like a grandparent or a family member that had died and you thought they were stuck in purgatory, you could buy these indulgences and it would spring them out, right? Hence the saying in the pamphlet, this pamphlet right here, because the final lines right there actually in German say, when a penny in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs, right? And you can actually see it right here, springa, and Himmel is actually, of course, meaning going into the sky or springing into heaven, right? So enraged by this, though, is when Luther will decide to write his 95 Theses, right? So Luther really hammers home the concept of being very anti-indulgence, right? And this event and these indulgences that were being pushed in the Holy Roman Empire by by Leo X and Johann Tetzel is going to be the impetus for him to actually writing it, right? Now, really, really quickly, just to give you a heads up, the 95 Theses is probably actually a letter, okay? Now, for those of you who actually know anything about European history, which I know a lot of you already do, you've probably seen this image before of Martin Luther hammering this document to the door of the church in Wittenberg, Germany, which I've actually been to. It's a really cool church. And the reason why he did that, though, is because he was a university professor, right? And for those of you who have ever been onto a university campus and you've seen those big, the big kiosk things, or not kiosks, there's a word for them, I can't remember what it is. The big round things where you post, like, oh, rush this fraternity, or blah, 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 or I'm selling a car. So the church doors in early universities served as a place to put announcements and letters and dialogues and things like that. So him posting it on the church doors would have been a huge act of defiance. But in reality, he probably didn't do that. In reality, it was just a letter written to a nearby bishop, right? Because the chances are that he never actually nailed him to the door of that church, which I know is a little bit of a letdown, right? So it's a little bit of a letdown because we all love that image of being like, ha, 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 and him actually throwing it up there, but it probably didn't happen, right? So now, in response, though, we need to understand, though, he was called to Rome in 1519, and when he was called to Rome, he refused to take back his ideas, right? So about 2 years after he posted, because he posted on October 31st, on Halloween Day, in 1517, right, is when he actually writes it. And just to give you an understanding of what the 95 Thesis says, right? So if we actually look at a 95 Thesis document, right, so we'll go PDF. Now, and we actually take a little gander at this bad boy real quick, you'll actually see that it is very long, right? And it is 95 different theses, right? And theses are points to be proven in a dialogue, right? And there's a lot of different things that relate back to his ideas, right? Of faith alone, scripture alone, and things like that. Because if we look for the word scripture, right, it appears in this document at least once, because he says, I cannot be proved otherwise by reason of scripture, right? And you can also see things like faith are actually outlined in it. Well, actually, it says it's not in there at all. But here's the crazy part. The word indulgence apparently appears in the 95 Theses upwards of, there they are, indulgence. It appears in this document 49 times, right? His main thing he was going against was indulgences. Look at it highlighting every single time it's mentioned, right? It is insane that he's literally, so as you can see, it's mentioned constantly, right? Where the ideas of his, views of the change of the church are not as outlined, right? But it is a huge protest against indulgences, right? And so what he ends up doing, though, after he gets called to Rome and he refuses to go and he refuses to take back his ideas, he begins to actually print out pamphlet versions of this bad boy, right? So we need to understand the impact that the printing press had on the Reformation and the proliferation of the 95 Theses, right? So the fact of the matter is he also included in those pamphlets as well other ideas that he had on top of his protests of the 95 Theses, including the fact that he believed that popes could err, right? When I say err, I mean they could do things wrong, right? Because there's this concept that was actually preached in the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages and also going into the 1500s, known as papal infallibility, right? We're basically saying that the Pope and anything that the pontificate says is actually always going to be for fact, right? Well, he actually, though, Martin Luther did something very bold, and politically speaking, he went at probably the most highest electable official and highest in power official, you could argue, in all of Europe by saying he can be wrong and he can do things that are not right. And he can even be morally corrupt, right? So going into it also, he said as well, is that if church leaders refuse to change the Pope, not the Pope, but if the church leaders refuse to change the church and refuse to remand and reform the ways that the Catholic Church at the time was acting, he said that it is the obligation of secular leaders, of kings and monarchs, to intervene, and begin to change the church in their own ways, right? And that he also said, now this is a big one, he said that there is no difference between a lay person and a clergy, right? So the thing that you have to understand about Martin Luther's bigger ideas is that he's beginning to put out there is that he believes that the fact that a person has to go talk to a priest to receive God's grace, he believes is not true, right? He believes also that it doesn't have anything in Scripture that says that that's actually necessarily true. So he actually preached this concept called the priesthood of all believers, right? By basically saying that you yourself have just as much of an access to God as a priest does, right? That you don't necessarily need them to do a confession. You can just pray, right? And so now this is going to be a really, really aggressive thing because it's attacking the hierarchy of the church, right? Now, here's the question, though. How is the papacy going to respond when Martin Luther refused to go down there in 1519? Because he knows what happened to Jan Hus, right? He knows what happened to Jan Hus when he was burned at the stake at the Council of Constance in 14, I believe it's 17? All right, But the big thing we need to understand, though, okay, the Pope is going to respond by giving Martin Luther 2 months to reject all of these ideas, right? He said that you've got 2 months, Luther, to reject the ideas that you have brought out there, to send them away and to say that you were not right and that you were lying and to issue a public statement, or you will be excommunicated, right? And in the process of doing this, the Pope begins to collect a massive amount of the pamphlets that Martin Luther had been actually circulating throughout the Holy Roman Empire up until this point. Over the year that he spent doing this, he collected a huge volume of these pamphlets, and he had burnings, public burnings of these pamphlets and of the words of Martin Luther and his ideas, copies of the 95 Theses, any books that he contributed to, because Martin Luther wrote several books on his ideas, right? Somewhere in the neighborhood of 26 of them, right? And so he held book burnings of his works, and what will happen is a pamphlet war will begin to ensue, right? So now really quickly though, right here is Martin Luther holding the letter, holding the papal bull that he was literally told to recant his ideas or face excommunication, and he has it right here, and he's like, well, look, I heard the Pope burned my writings, so you know what? Boom. And he drops that papal bull into a fire in Wittenberg, Germany, in like one of the most populated cities at the time. And sprinkled around him are these people known as the German princes. That one being the most famous one right there. That guy's name is Frederick the Wise, right? And several other German princes, because you have to understand who rules most of the Holy Roman Empire, right? You've got the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, who does have like final say over a lot of things, and he is elected by the electors, but the German princes lead these different principalities, and they actually are in charge of like the smaller feudal dwellings, right? And because of that, he's trying to go through them because he's trying to earn some followers, because 9/10 of Germany supported Luther even after these threats, right? 9 out of every 10 German prince supported Luther after these threats and saw what he was doing and saw that he was about to enter into a pamphlet war with the Pope himself, and they respected him and they liked it. And they also probably saw it as a chance to seize power, right? So now an interesting little thing about this though, pamphlet war, what one is basically Martin Luther started writing pamphlets in response to the like excommunication papal bull, right? And then the Pope started writing them in response back, and they started getting proliferated like all over Europe, right? And so that's what a pamphlet war is. It's basically just talking junk to each other in pamphlet form, right? So going into it though, what ends up happening after that is he famously says, "Death to the court of Rome," right? In one of his pamphlets in one of these pamphlet wars, right? And "death to the court of Rome" is a famous saying, or what he's trying to get at is basically that the papacy is now no more than a monarchical court, right? Remember when we talked about the courtier by Baldassare Castiglione, and we talked about the concepts that were outlined in it, and the idea that a courtier is like a princely advisor, or an advisor that is a noble that has been raised and educated very, very well to the point where he can advise a king. Well, basically though, these court parties and stuff like that were also very what's the word I'm looking for? Debaucherous sometimes, right? These court parties would sometimes have like very much like Lotharios within inside of them. They would be doing things that are immoral in these courts, right? And so by Martin Luther saying "death to the court of Rome," he's basically calling the Pope a monarch, and he's basically saying that all he wants to do is party, hang out, and have people kiss his butt, right? Like, so the thing about it that you have to understand, though, that this will continue to enrage the fight between the two, right? And what it actually ends up resulting in is, now that Martin Luther has been excommunicated from the church, what now needs to happen is Charles V must intervene, right? The young king, right? The young Holy Roman Emperor must intervene. The Habsburg prince himself must intervene and try to get Martin Luther to stop saying what he's saying. And the reason why he needs to do this is mostly due to the fact that this could lead to violence and warfare. And he knows that the German princes are beginning to support Martin Luther, and that they may themselves actually hide him, right? So the Diet of Worms would be called after this, right? And the Diet of Worms, what it is, and technically you're not supposed to say Diet of Worms, you're supposed to say Diet of Worms, right? Because Worms is the city that it was held in, okay? Worms, Germany. And a diet, what it is a meeting, right? Like it's a meeting or a council, right? And so the Diet of Worms was called, and this was a meeting that was called by Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, to tell Luther to take back his ideas, right? They accused him of different heresies. They said to him, "Did you write all of these books that lay in front of us," right? And Martin Luther said, "Yeah, I did." And they were like, "Do you know of the heretical value of these texts, right? Will you take back the things you said, or face possibly an inquisition and your ever so prominent death," right? And they threatened him with death. And they were like, "We'll arrest you and we'll bring you in front of an inquisition." And you know what happens to people when that ends up going down? You probably might get burned at the stake, right? Martin Luther, actually, fun fact as well, almost took everything back. Like, he almost did it. He got freaked out and a little nervous and stuff like that. But then literally, he refused to give in to the demands, and he refused to recant, which Charles V will condemn him as a heretic, send him into an inquisition, and send him to his death sentence, right? And it was at that diet that they actually began the process of actually giving him execution orders, right? And he said famously, unless I am convinced by evidence of Scripture or by plain reason, I cannot and will not recant anything, for it is neither safe nor right to go against my conscience, which he believed was blessed with him by God, right? So you have to understand him going against not only the Pope, but now also the Holy Roman Emperor, and then also siding with the German princes is going to be something that can escalate things very dramatically, right? And this approach did not actually earn him less followers, it actually earned him a lot more, right? It made his name even bigger, and it grew him an even larger audience, right? And what ends up happening is as they were transporting him from the Diet of Worms in 1521 to the place where he was supposed to be executed and face an Inquisition trial formally, they actually took him into hiding. Literally, the German princes staged a whole, abduction, and they actually took him off the road and brought him into hiding. Particularly the guy who was named Frederick the Wise. That guy that was in the picture with him in the background, one of those German princes. You have to understand, the German princes are very important, okay? Like, in this entire story, knowing who the German princes are and knowing what their role is and when they play into hiding Martin Luther and keeping him alive until the day that he died in 1547 is really, really important, right? So Martin Luther goes into hiding as of 1521 and stays in hiding for the rest of his life, right? Being slowly moved around from castle to castle, right? And in this hiding, he starts doing a lot of his biggest work, right? He starts creating the German New Testament and actually translating the Bible from Latin into German, right? And it was in this moment that you could argue that the Lutheran Church was born, right? In the 1520s that followed, when he began to write down all of his ideas. And then that is going to create the very first successful Protestant sect that will grow very aggressively in German-speaking lands, right? So the German New Testament, he writes while he's in hiding, and speaking of while he was in hiding and stuff like that, a lot of Protestantism and a lot of these new thinkers start popping up out of nowhere, right? Because this is going to be where Protestantism begins to spread, right? Protestantism, there we go. And one of the guys that pops up out of nowhere, right? Because it turns out that Martin Luther served kind of as an example of what there were other scholars out there, right? Because if there is one Martin Luther, there's got to be more of him. And one that popped up was a man by the name of Ulrich Zwingli, right? Who was actually Swiss, right? So Swiss being from Switzerland. There you go, Cassie. Yeah, Switzerland. Yay! So the big thing about though going into it, okay? Ulrich Zwingli is a guy that popped up and he was raised and also taught in the Catholic Church to be a priest and stuff like that. And he decides to go meet with Luther at this place called the Marburg Schloss, which is actually Frederick the Wise's castle or palace, right? Schloss means palace or castle. Now, so meets with Luther while he's in hiding, right? And it turns out that they agreed about a lot, but they actually disagreed about some things as well, right? He wanted the idea to preach Erasmus's New Testament from A to Z. Because remember, Erasmus translated the Bible first into Greek, right? Before Martin Luther ever even did it, right? But Martin Luther is going to be excommunicated and start his own new sect of Christianity known as Lutheranism, whereas Erasmus stayed a Catholic his entire life, right? Now, he wants to preach Erasmus's New Testament from A to Z, from the very beginning to the very end, in order, right? And he agreed with Luther on many things, like the idea of vernacular Bibles that have been translated so people that can read, right? For the idea of changing certain ceremonial things, right? With the ideas of faith alone, grace alone, Scripture alone, right? He agreed with him on the corruption of the church, the Mass, that indulgences need to be gotten rid of. But he disagreed with him on a lot of ceremonial things, right? And he was like, yeah, and I mean, can you believe that they think the bread turns into Jesus, right? And then Martin Luther was like, well, I don't necessarily know if that's not true, right? And so they actually started arguing with each other, right? He disagreed on the Eucharist and what it does, and that led to an early split of Protestant thought, right? Because what you can actually see is not all of these Protestant thinkers are created equally, right? Luther had his own ideas, and so his church followed those, right? Zwingli had his own ideas, and they turned into these people called the Anabaptists that people hate with a fury, right? Now. And then another one pops up a little bit later on. Keep this name in the back of your mind. Do me a favor. Keep it in the back of your mind. Store it away for a hot second. John Calvin actually pops up during the process of while Luther is in hiding, because he goes into hiding in 1521. John Calvin starts actually creating his new sect of Protestantism in the 1530s, between 1536 and 1537, right? And so he creates this thing known as Calvinism, right? And Calvinism is a really big deal, right? Because there's tons of Calvinists Calvinists out there. For example, for those of y'all who are in Mr. Roddy's class right now, if you're reading the Crucible, Puritans are a type of Calvinist, right? So that's the type of like Protestant that they are. And so this famous argument actually leads to an early split in Protestant thought, and we begin to see new sects of it grow and rise up very quickly within the span of about 20 years, right? And this right here is an actual painting on a German like a box, like a power box of Martin Luther and Zwingli fighting and kind of arguing with each other and stuff like that, right? Actually, apparently Luther like hated his guts. Luther's also kind of an odd guy, like he's a little bit of a weird dude. But the thing that you need to kind of focus in on this is that do Protestants agree on everything? And that's a big fat inflammatory no, right? So like they do not agree on everything, right? And the transubstantiation dispute or the Marburg officer argument serves as a great example of that, right? Because Catholics, Lutherans, and Zwingli / Anabaptists all have different thoughts on the idea of transubstantiation, right? Transubstantiation is the concept that like the piece of Eucharist, right, turns into the physical body and the wine turns into the physical blood of Christ following the blessing of a priest and also its consumption, right? Because Catholics believe that after the priest consecrates the wine and bread, it literally becomes Christ, right? Luther, on the other hand, thought that Christ is present in the Eucharist, but because of God, not because of a priest, right? Maybe not a full transformation, but he is there in essence, right? And Zwingli was like, it's just bread. So like now he's like, Christ isn't in the bread. It's just it's a spirituality practice. It's like a fun little thing we do, right? To symbolize his like sacrifice, right? But he's not physically actually there, right? So as you can see, this is going to lead to those early splits and those early derivations and the creations of these new churches, right? Now, another thing that we need to understand about Protestantism and the growth of the Protestant Reformation is there's a lot of myths out there about it, right? For example, one of the biggest myths about Protestantism and the spread of Protestantism throughout Europe during the 1500s is the fact that it appealed to the poor, but not to the rich, right? Like everybody's like, oh, it just appealed to the poor. That's why it grew so fast, right? No, actually, the fact of the matter is by 1650, people of all classes had begun to reject Catholic thought, and they began to actually gravitate towards Protestantism. Now, a big thing that we need to understand, though, is that Catholicism is still the dominant form of Christianity in Europe, right? To this day, there are more Catholics than there are anything else, right? Because France is still predominantly Catholic, Spain, Portugal, Italy, most of Switzerland, or like parts of Switzerland anyway. Actually, I don't know. I might need to look this up. Ooh, let's go ahead and let's jump over here real quick. Actually, so are there more Catholics or Protestants in Europe? All right, so now this is a really good question. Yeah, see, knew it. Yeah, there's still more of them, whereas then there's Orthodoxy and a couple other ones. But yeah, 48% of European Christians are still Catholic, right? That's what I thought. I was pretty confident in that. But the thing about it that you need to understand, though, most of America is Protestant, right? So now, and most of America is Protestant because a heavy number of Protestants from these areas in Europe went off and colonized in the name of their mother countries, right? But for example, like New Orleans is still a very Catholic-like city because it was colonized by the French, and the French stayed very Catholic, right? Even amidst all of this Protestantism and its spread, right? Now, the big thing that you need to also understand, though, okay, an appeal to this entire idea, okay, and the reason why the Protestantism was growing not only with the poor but also with the wealthy is mostly due to the fact that Protestant thought is easier and less complicated. So like now, it's going to grow very, very quickly because it's not so much based on ceremony as it is based on rationality and you reading the scripture, and it also doesn't require a lot of sacramental duties, right? You don't have to check off certain boxes, okay? For example, like you don't have to go to confession in most Protestant churches, right? It's just something that you can do, or you can go talk to a priest or a pastor about it, right? There's less ceremony, more faith. It also advocates for vernacular Bibles, right? Which is this idea of reading on your own, right? And so that's going to end up turning a lot of monks from the Catholic Church over to Protestant thought and thinking. Actually, fun fact, one of those people that ends up turning themselves from Catholic thought to Protestant thought is actually Martin Luther's wife that he gets married to. Yeah, because he used to be a monk and stuff like that, and he took vows of celibacy, but then he ended up getting married to a nun. Oh, and so now, so going into it, though, also clergy, they believe, should pay taxes, right? The printing press will be something really, really big about Protestant thought and ideas because you're now printing vernacular Bibles with pictures. So that's a really big deal as well. The art of engraving from the Renaissance is going to be used to create new Bibles that actually contain imagery in them and stuff like that, so it appeals to the poor as well. Protestant work ethic's a big one as well, and that kind of actually brings in why wealthy people even liked Protestant thought, because a lot of people began to associate the amount of money that you had with your prosperity and closeness to God, right? So, for example, the Dutch were really big ones, big thinkers of this, right? The wealthier you were, it meant the better you were for God, or the harder you worked, it means the more prosperous you would become, right? We'll talk about the Protestant work ethic a little bit as well in class, because I was raised in a very Protestant work ethic kind of community, and I can kind of explain it a little bit better to you that way, right? But basically think about it like this, that work brings you closer to God, right? And the idea that you should just be working all the time, right? And that if you work hard enough, you'll be rewarded, okay? So celibacy and priest marriage marriage is also a big thing as well, because the priests do not have to be celibate in in Protestant churches, and they're allowed to get married. And also, divorce in some situations is looked on as a little bit more ethical in Protestant churches, right? And we'll get into that whole thing in England, right? Now, Luther's ideas appealed to so many that the German princes in the Holy Roman Empire actually hid him and protected him. But this is later on going to backfire a little bit, specifically when we talk about this thing known as the German Peasants' Revolt in 1525. But we'll talk about that in class. I'll see y'all then.